Prince was one of the most iconic artists of the modern era. He was a man whose music redefined genres, whose performances lit up stadiums, and whose creative genius built a legacy worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But on April 21st, 2016, when Prince died suddenly at his home in Minnesota, all that brilliance collided with one simple, devastating reality. He had no will, no estate plan, no roadmap for what should happen with the empire he had built. What followed was a 6-year legal battle to sort everything out for his heirs. Lawyers, accountants, and advisors all fighting over how his fortune should be divided. His family was fractured, his music catalog, one of the most valuable in the world, sat in limbo, unable to be used or released as it should have been. And perhaps most tragically, the values Prince held, whatever they may have been, were silenced. Because without a plan, the state stepped in, and the government decided who got what. And it's safe to say the outcome didn't reflect the kind of careful, intentional legacy someone like Prince could have left behind. All those years of hard work, all those assets, all that potential for impact left vulnerable because he never made a plan. Prince's story is a reminder. Estate planning isn't just about money. It's about peace. It's about protecting your loved ones. It's about ensuring your values live on beyond you. And as we'll see today, even kings of Israel faced the same challenge. Some did it well, others left chaos in their wake. Welcome to Plan to Prosper, where we exist to honor God by equipping faithful servants to steward their finances wisely and build wealth that endures for generations. All right, we are back for another episode of Plan to Prosper, and today we have a very special guest on the show with us, Stonecrop's chairman and CEO, Douglas MacGray. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you for having me.
We are excited to talk about estate planning today. We heard about Prince in the cold opening, but we're going to look at some kings now, and two very different kings in the Old Testament and how their estate plans compared to each other.
There are a few other examples, relatively recent examples of people who haven't created a good estate plan. Aretha Franklin, valued at $80 million when she died. Pablo Picasso in the 70s. I saw a New York Times article that said his was worth $1.1 billion at the time. And then two others that kind of point to the value of doing it as early as you can. Bob Marley was 36. His was valued at $11.5 million. And Jimi Hendrix, I think he was 26. Okay, 26. His was, from what I saw, worth $20,000 because of debt, but it's been managed in a way in which it's now worth like $175 million.
Wow. I'm noticing a trend there. It's all creatives, all artists. Yeah.
Huh.
So
Those are the ones we hear about.
true. Yeah, I mean, they're obviously extremely famous for what they did too. So
Made a lot of money.
that makes sense. Before we jump into the meat of the episode, can you share a little bit, Doug, about your history in estate planning, and then also what, for anybody that is listening that maybe wouldn't know otherwise, what you're doing now? And yeah.
Okay, sure. When I graduated from college, went off overseas for a couple of years to do some missionary work in Micronesia. Then I came back and went to law school and decided to become a lawyer. And when so I went to Suffolk Law School up in Boston, and when I graduated from there, got involved in a firm and did a variety of things, and ultimately leaned in the direction of doing estate planning because it was a lot closer to actual clients. Litigation work and things like that didn't excite me a whole lot because it was more about gamesmanship and all this, and some people were really good at it and loved it, and I thought, okay, I don't love this, so I should go in a direction that I'll enjoy more. And estate planning, where you're working with real clients and real client issues, and was the direction I went. So I did that, practiced law privately for about a dozen years. And then I had my own firm, and then ultimately was recruited by a financial planning firm that was looking for someone that had an estate planning background, and that was something I had not been expecting. And ultimately, long story, but I eventually went into that company and fell in love with financial planning. Got my CFP, Certified Financial Planner designation pretty quickly to broaden kind of my knowledge base and expertise, and have been doing that ever since. And 5+ years ago, started Stonecrop Wealth Advisors along with Logan. and have added people since then, and that's the short history.
Very good. So as we look even before we jump into the kings of Israel and their estate plans, I think if we could at least set the stage for listeners about what estate planning is and why it matters.
Yeah, estate planning is oftentimes when we ask clients and we ask people, is your estate plan up to date? There's a certain amount of people, it's not the majority, but a sizable minority who just look at you and say, estate plan? I don't have an estate. I don't have enough money to, and so when you say, well, do you have a will? They understand that. So people generally understand that, and when you ask them and the answer is no, you can see that pang of guilt. I know I need to do this. And so everyone in the back of their mind knows it's important. I very, very rarely run into anyone who says, nah, I don't need to do that. I can't remember the last time anyone said that. I'll let the state decide where it goes. But many, many people who have not done one. So estate planning essentially is just, in its simplest state, definition is just taking your financial assets, things that have a financial worth, and I would go against this definition, but this is the one that people know about most, is your financial net worth, and saying, okay, how is that going to be distributed? Look at your net worth statement. Look at your life insurance. Where is that all going to go? That's estate planning. This is my estate. How am I going to plan where it goes if something happens to me? And so that's been the most basic part of estate planning. And we'll talk further today about how it really should have a more broad interpretation, especially people of the Christian faith who want to pass down their values to the next generation and bless the next generation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Real quickly, you mentioned financial. Well, you mentioned net worth.
Right.
What are your thoughts on net worth being assets minus liabilities?
I hate the term net worth because you think, my first thought when I hear the term net worth is that all I'm worth? And excuse me, when you think about it, people have a variety of items or a variety of things you can name that define their worth. And assets minus liabilities is the financial component of your net worth. But you have an educational background, you have relationships, you have the ability to create relationships, you have the books you have read, the movies you have watched. Hopefully you've read the books first. You have all sorts of background and talents and natural attributes, gifts that you have that all add up to your net worth. We all know people who have no money who we look at and say, that person's going somewhere. That person has a big net worth or a big worth. So yeah, we even at Stonecrop have been toying with using another phrase for that, maybe just calling it your financial balance sheet or financial net worth, to make sure we're distinguishing between the financial part of your net worth and realizing that there are many other components to what you're worth. And that does tie into estate planning.
Right. There's a verse in Judges that says, after that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done for Israel.
That, to me, I was thinking of that verse coming in here because it is probably, for me, it's the saddest verse in the Bible, that an entire generation went from knowing God to not knowing God. And it is a warning and an admonition for us to not let that happen. And that's why it's in the Word. So that's why it's a good verse to know, but it's a really sad verse.
So let's jump into, we're going to look at King David and King Jehoshaphat and compare what did they do and how did they do it differently? How did they handle their estate plans differently that led to flourishing in one case and not so much in the other? So let's jump into King David's first.
Sure. A lot of people don't look at it from an estate planning background, but I guess when you are an estate planner or have done financial planning, and estate planning has been a big part of it, and you're starting to read, you see it through that lens. So as I was reading through the Old Testament at one point, and thinking about estate planning and a presentation I wanted to put together, I started to read it from that lens and realized that King David had some very specific ideas as what he wanted to do during his life. And we all have that. We want to build a business, we want to get a job, we want to get married, have children, all those things. And he had those specific plans. He wanted to build a temple, and he was told, "You're not doing that." And he wanted to be obedient, so he said, "Okay, I'm not going to do that." But he still wanted to honor God with that temple, and he had a successful kingship, and he had amassed a lot of wealth. So in his mind, he's thinking, "Okay, how am I going to now? I can't build this temple while I'm alive. So how do I want to bless the next generation with this temple?" And he did two things. One is, with my finances, I'm going to make sure those are pre-planned. So he gave a lot of assets to the next generation, but essentially in trust. Here are these assets. You're going to build a temple with them. And he didn't just say that. He had all these very specific plans. So instead of doing the work, he planned it all out. So that was essentially his estate plan with his financial wealth. On the other side of it, he actually looked at his array of sons, and he had a bunch of them, and the default position back then was number one son gets it. That number one son is the one who's going to determine what happens with all this wealth and how the kingdom will go from here. And he looked at his sons and said, "No, that's not what I'm going to do." I forget which number of son it was, 6th or 7th or whatever, Solomon. And he saw that Solomon was the one he was going to give the wealth to manage and give the kingdom to direct. And so he began a process of training Solomon spiritually to make sure that he would be up for the job. So I'm giving you all this wealth. Here's what you're going to do with it. You can only plan so much. You eventually have to let another person actually execute that. And he went against the default position and chose Solomon to do that.
Yeah. I'll read Proverbs because choosing Solomon,
Right.
who then went on to write his own portions of Scripture, including Proverbs. In Proverbs 4, verse 3 through 9, Solomon says, "When I was a son with my father, tender, the only one in the sight of my mother, he taught me and said to me, 'Let your heart hold fast my words, keep my commandments and live. Get wisdom, get insight. Do not forget, do not turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her, and she will keep you. Love her, and she will guard you. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom, and whatever you get insight. Prize her highly, and she will exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her. She will place on your head a graceful garland, and she will bestow on you a beautiful crown.'"
Right, so it should come as no surprise when Solomon was confronted by God and said, "What do you want? Anything. I'll give you anything." It was no accident that he said, "I want wisdom," because David had instilled that in him. It wasn't just when I remember years ago growing up hearing that story about Solomon, saying, "Wasn't that cool that Solomon asked for wisdom?" Well, there's a good reason for that. David instilled that in him. So he realized that if I'm going to pass on all this wealth to somebody else, that somebody else better be ready to handle it, because this is a big responsibility. And he wanted to bless the next generation. Mm-hmm. And so he didn't want to just bless them by saying, here's all the wealth I've amassed, have a ball. It was, no, here's all the wealth I've amassed. Here's what you do with it if you want to bless the next generation.
Yeah. And passing along those godly values.
Yeah.
I think it really is generational. There's even another verse actually in the New Testament where it shows kind of generational faith. It says in 2 Timothy 1:5, "For I am mindful of the sincere faith within you, which first dwelled in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am sure that it is in you as well."
Yeah. Paul recognized that generational passing on of values for sure.
You also mentioned that David established something like a trust, and I'll read 1 Chronicles 22. For David said, Solomon, my son, is young and inexperienced, and the house that is to be built for the Lord must be exceedingly magnificent, of fame and glory throughout all lands. I will therefore make preparation for it. So David provided materials in great quantity before his death.
Exactly. When you think about a trust, when people, so in today's language, we would call that a trust, and that comes from the English common law. So they didn't have, the concept of a trust was actually existed back in biblical days. It actually mentions it. Paul mentions it. I forget exactly where. I should remember that. But trusts have been around forever.
Was it still like a legal thing back then, or was it kind of more of just I'm going to honor you because you said?
No, it was legal. I mean, in the Old Testament, because it was more of an oral culture, they used a lot of different ways. So instead of a deed to a property, they would go out to the city gate and gather the elders and hand a sandal to somebody. So you can see that with Boaz, for example. Mm-hmm. There are different ways that they would create, make it legal. Now we do it. We create a deed. We record it with a recorder of deeds, and that's how we do it. But it's always been around. So yeah, there were trusts that were around back then as well, in one way, shape, or form, and the legality was a little more difficult because you can remember with the way kings went from one king to another, it wasn't always smooth. And even David to Solomon wasn't smooth. I believe it was Adonijah was his oldest son. I believe that's the name. He immediately, when David died, was like, okay, I'm it. Mm-hmm. And there were issues, and it was touch and go. So the legal succession wasn't. It was fairly well established, but it wasn't smooth because there were people who would fight against it. So yeah, there was a legal process, but not quite as formal as today. But it still existed. The concept still existed for sure.
David also utters this prayer in 1 Chronicles, and I think this could serve as a model for Christian stewardship. But he says, "But who am I and who are my people that we should be able to give as generously as this? Everything comes from you, and we have given you only what comes from your hand."
Yeah. Ultimately, when we are being generous in any, whether it's philanthropy or to our children or anybody, that is such a great verse to rely on. All philanthropy should rest on this verse. We talk about how God loves a cheerful giver. One of the reasons we should be cheerful in giving is we're stewards of things that God has granted to us, and to the extent we're giving it, we're only giving what God has given us anyway. So that's a great verse. Everything comes from you, and we have given you only what comes from your hand. So just starting with the recognition, it's not mine anyway, and then getting into the mode of being cheerful in giving. One of the reasons I think you can be cheerful in giving is because you know that what you're giving is going to do something good. That's why Christians are not people who are wise don't give to a charity that they don't know much about. We had one client who was very, very philanthropically motivated. She didn't have a whole lot of money, but she had a lot of compassion, a lot of misplaced compassion. And every time she got one of those envelopes in the mail that had the pictures of, suffering animals or people with a cleft palate, or you name it, the ones that really grab you, she would break out a checkbook and send a check to hundreds of different charities, many of which, when we looked into them, were horrible charities. And so that's, most people, when they really think about it, realize if I'm going to be cheerful in giving, I really want to make sure those dollars are doing something that excites me, that'll bless people. That's where the cheerfulness comes in. And so David certainly was cheerful in doing this because that thing was really on his heart to put that temple to bless the Lord. It was going to happen. Not in his lifetime, but it was going to happen.
Yeah.
And so the trust is the best way to do that? Like if you have something in your mind that you want done, but it's going to take longer than your life, is the trust the best way to do that?
Depending on what the property is, but there are two components to the next generation. One is a trust allows you to put in a lot of very specific instructions, but you can't anticipate everything. And so you need to put in a trustee, in this case it was Solomon, who's going to actually execute those instructions. And so build the temple, here are my specific instructions, but there are going to be discretionary decisions Solomon's going to have to make, or whoever's going to have to make, in this case it was Solomon. So I have to choose someone who's going to make wise decisions. And so the garden variety trust that people do now is everything to my spouse, and then if my spouse is not living when I die, equally to my children. And then if they're young, then one common example is 1/3 they get at 25, 1/3 at 30, 1/3 at 35, or something like that. And before they turn 25, the trustee used the money to pay for college and for A, B, and C. Well, if they give that trustee any discretion, then I, as the person creating that trust, really want that trustee to be a wise person who can make good decisions. So there are two components. One is the very specific instructions, or maybe they're not specific. Maybe they're just very broad. And number two is picking someone who you trust, you have either known or trained or whatever, who's going to follow or execute those in a manner that makes the most sense. So a trust really makes the most sense because you can control to a large degree what happens. There are other ways to pass down wealth. You can start a business and sell it to the person who you know will succeed you, and train that person who's going to succeed you. That's to run a business. But as far as your wealth goes and making sure it's going to be doing the things you want it to do, a trust is a very, very powerful instrument.
I was reading a while ago a book. It was written probably 25 years ago, called The Millionaire Next Door. And I don't remember the exact number, but it was something to the effect of a surprising amount of millionaires in America were first-generation millionaires.
Right.
So I think a lot of us that maybe don't come from wealth have this intuitive understanding that people that have a lot of money, they were just born into it. But that really actually isn't the case. A lot of people are self-made millionaires in our country, and then they pass it down to the next generation. And then the book talks about how a lot of that wealth disappears fairly quickly. So in Solomon's case, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, was this generational wealth transfer a successful thing, and why?
Well, sure, and that's one of the things with that the law has recognized, the common law over the years, is that there's only so much control you as a trustee of your wealth should be able to manage. And so there have been rules on the books, laws on the books for years saying you can control this property for so long, but much longer. It's called the rule against perpetuities, and there have been some changes to it for a while. But it makes sense because I can create a trust that might control to a large degree what happens in the next generation. But then the generations after that, that's really too far. That's up to the next generation. So I can maybe control with a trust what my children do, maybe my grandchildren to a small extent, but then they're on their own. So it has to keep going. So what David did really blessed Solomon and the ability of Solomon to bless Israel, and it was wildly successful. Now, what happened after that? Pretty hard to blame David for that. The kingdom split, and then we all know what happened after that.
Could you argue that that's potentially because Solomon started seeking idols and maybe not instilling the values in his sons as well?
Absolutely. And later in his life, Solomon lived a long time, and the next generation for sure was blessed as long as Solomon was alive. Now, because Solomon didn't repeat the pattern with his son that took over, didn't do a good job. And so did he instill those values in Rehoboam and Jeroboam the way that David had instilled to him? Obviously not. Or at least it wasn't successful if he tried. But it doesn't seem like he tried, and he didn't set a good example later in life with all the concubines and all the things he did to kind of drift away from his faith.
But I think it's a good warning, or just maybe even an encouragement for Christians leaving behind wealth to their next generation, that like you talked about earlier, it's not just about the assets that you're giving them. It's the values being equally, or not equally, more important to pass down
Right.
than just the money, to ensure wise stewardship of it in the next generation.
Because I feel like to Solomon, it might have looked like a great success because he did complete the temple.
Right. And it, if you think about it, it was in the sense of think about how long he was a king. I forget how many years, but many decades. And that generation of Israelites was incredibly blessed. So what David did with his estate plan blessed an entire generation. Now, it was up to Solomon to carry the torch for the generation after that. He did not do as good of a job. So every generation has this imperative. And I have one, you're the next generation, you'll have your own imperative, but we all have it. And that's a perfect illustration from David down to Solomon. Okay, Solomon, now it's your turn. And it wasn't as bad as the verse that you mentioned in Judges. The entire next generation didn't know, but it was going in the wrong direction, unfortunately.
Yeah. So yeah, I think our encouragement is making sure in any estate plan that you're putting together, your wills or whatever, that there is as strong of an emphasis on the values that you hold dear to you.
Yes, and we'll get to that with Jehoshaphat, I think. So,
yeah. So let's dive into it. So let's contrast what did David? We looked at what David did.
Yeah.
What did Jehoshaphat do?
Well, Jehoshaphat was interesting when I was thinking this through, because I was just going through all the various kings as you go through the history. And Jehoshaphat came after Asa. Asa was described as a man after God's own heart. So was Jehoshaphat. In fact, 2 Chronicles 17:3 says, "The Lord was with Jehoshaphat because he followed the ways of his father David before him." So, good guy, good king, evidently, doing a lot of the right things. And it talks about some of the things he did. And so you look at Jehoshaphat and think, okay, as long as he was king, Israel was in a pretty good place. But so that was, if you compare that to David, very, very similar. But Jehoshaphat also had a bunch of, and he reigned for 25 years, died of natural causes. The Israel was blessed by his leadership. And then he had, I believe it was 7 sons. He had a bunch of sons. And he did, by what we can see, he did no pre-planning. He didn't train up his sons. He certainly didn't train up the son who became king. He didn't look at his sons and size up, okay, which one's going to be the best king? He just left it to the default. Number one gets it. And the Bible is very clear, and Elijah actually is very clear in what he says, that his oldest son, Jehoshaphat's oldest son, was the worst of them. And so he left it to his firstborn son. There's zero indication that he prepared him to be a spiritual leader. And that was Jehoram.
Was that per estate plan, or did he just let the default happen?
It appears as that he purposefully did that. He was following the default, but he didn't just die and do nothing, because he did leave assets and smaller cities to his other sons, and it specifically states that. But he did what all kings were supposed to do back then, and say, number one son gets leadership of the entire kingdom, gets the lion's share or whatever, the double share or whatever it was back then. But so he purposefully went with the default. I don't think it was accidentally. He didn't just step back and do nothing. But yeah, it was clear once the Bible starts talking about Jehoram, that Jehoram was not prepared to lead, that he was pretty evil, and he actually married one of the daughters of Ahab, who was in the northern kingdom and was a bad dude. And it's unclear when you read it, did he marry that daughter before or after Jehoshaphat died? But by reading between the lines and reading it all, it's pretty clear that Jehoshaphat should have known what kind of a man Jehoram was. I believe he was 32.
Would that have also been a child of Jezebel?
Well, I believe so. I believe he only had children from Jezebel. I don't believe there are other daughters. So, obviously bad heritage. Everyone knew about that couple and how bad they were. Jehoram was obviously circulating in that crowd, and some of the things he did immediately when he became king, setting up, the wrong, to the Baals and things like that. So Jehoshaphat should have known what kind of a person his oldest son was, and yet he left it all to him anyway. So if he was trying to train him up in the way he should go, which there's no indication he did, it wasn't successful. He left it to him anyway, with no organization, no pre-planning, no trust type of a thing. This is what I'm leaving you, and this is what you must do with it. It was just, okay, I die, you take over as king. The next generation under Jehoram was the opposite of blessed. They were cursed. It was a horrible reign. It was an 8-year reign. Jehoram once he established his throne, he killed all his brothers, and completely went away from the ways of his father and his grandfather, and ended up one of it says ultimately when he dies that Jehoram died in great pain, and he passed away to no one's regret. So obviously the opposite of Solomon's reign. Can we criticize Solomon for kind of falling away at the end? Sure, but at least starting off, he was trained the right way. He did a lot of the right things. That generation was blessed. Jehoshaphat didn't do that, didn't create a thoughtful estate plan, didn't train the next generation. The next generation was cursed. And we can see parallels to that all over the place in any generation of our country or other places, or even biblically where that happens. And the cautions are incredible from those two stories.
Yeah, and obviously you can't control what your children actually end up doing once you pass away or when you're still alive. I think for all of us, we are trying to raise our kids to follow the Lord, and that just doesn't always happen. And that's a difficult thing. But nevertheless, I think kind of a big piece that I'm seeing here is the discipleship aspect of raising your children, not just planning ahead for what's going to happen when you die, but the entirety of your life while you have your time with your kids should be one of discipleship and trying to ensure that these values and this faith is instilled in them, so that when you're gone, they continue and pass on that mantle of faith.
Right, and that comes back to a question that Logan asked, is say, what do you feel about the term net worth? If all we are passing along is our finances, that's pretty easy. Go to a lawyer and get the right documents in place. You have a good financial planner who can make sure all the documents line up and the beneficiaries and all of that. But if your net worth consists of your values, if your net worth consists of your relationships, if your net worth consists of the wisdom that you have gained through all the books you have read and experiences you have had, the travels you have taken, the college you went to, all those things, you do, I believe, have a responsibility to pass all of your net worth down to the next generation. Then it's the next generation's responsibility. So this contrasts a little bit with people. We've all heard of situations where people are so wealthy that they want to control everything. So their trust is hundreds of pages long because they're trying to control everything. So it's not really an issue of control as Christians who want to bless the next generation. It's more of making sure those values get there so that the next generation can take the baton. Because once you pass away, you obviously have lost a lot of control. I mean, you might be able to control your money to a degree in your trust document, but the issue of control, it should be less about control and more about how can I bless the next generation. And to some degree, the simplest example is I have let's just say I have an 18-year-old son that's my only heir, and I'm on my deathbed and I leave everything to my 18-year-old son and I've got $10 million, that would not bless that 18-year-old to leave $10 million to him. They're very, very rare, if there is any that exist, who are wise enough to manage that 18 million, and that 18 million will probably hurt that child. So I'm going to bless that child, not by controlling every teeny little thing, but I'm going to say, okay, you get some now, you get some later, so do some things that will actually create an opportunity for that money to bless that child. If you try to control every dot and tittle of that money, then there'll be resentment on that 18-year-old for the rest of his life. That I can't believe I'm 45 years old and I'm still under my father's, trust that doesn't allow me to take out more than whatever. And so the control aspect can go way too far. I think it's just being thoughtful about how do I pass things on, and taking real responsibility for thinking, what is it that God has blessed me with that I can help with the next generation? So for someone who's getting older, I'll count myself as one of those, it kind of behooves me to set a good example for my grandchildren, to talk with them as they're getting older and wiser and developing their own thoughts and ideas, to make sure I'm passing along some things of value that'll make sense for them, so that they'll remember. So it can be as simple as writing out something where, this Bible that I have a lot of notes in, I'm going to leave this to my granddaughter so that she'll get it and cherish it and see some of my notes, and maybe that'll help pass along. So it's being thoughtful about, what are some ways in my particular life or situation where I can effectively potentially pass on some of these values to the next generations.
Yeah. So in the opening, when we talked about, you shared some examples of people that didn't have wills or didn't have any kind of estate plan, all those musicians and artists,
Right.
and talking about Prince. A common theme in those examples in particular was they were all fairly young. And I think a lot of people think, this is something I'll deal with later. When I'm approaching death, I'll set up my will and my estate plan. But the Lord numbers our days, and we never know when any particular day could be our last. And I think that speaks to the importance of, no matter how old you are, if you've built up any level of assets, setting this up right away is an important aspect of this. So we've talked about some of this already, but what are some simple things? So I've talked theoretically about this.
Sure.
What are some simple things that somebody could do to actually begin to establish their estate plan?
Well, I'll start with the high level, pun intended, concept that I sometimes use to get people to think about it. I'm not sure everyone thinks this way, but whenever I get in an airplane, as it's beginning to take off, I have that momentary thought of, okay, what if something happens?
I think about that the entirety of the flight.
Okay.
Me too.
And so the thought then is, okay, is everything in order? If something happens to me, will people be able to find things? And I had one of those thoughts in an airplane where I thought, I've got this one business bank account that I'm the only authorized signer on. Oh my gosh, I got to fix that. So it was it led to a very constructive thought, and I fixed that. Added another signer to that account and made sure I took care of that. So start with that concept if something happens to me. So that starts with making sure, but doesn't end with, making sure that you have the appropriate legal documents in place. So that starts with a will, importantly a power of attorney. We can get to some of these documents, and potentially a trust. But a will and a power of attorney, those are the most basic documents to have in place. But it also means, can my loved ones find them and find all my other important stuff? So we talk about, at Stonecrop, a concept of a box of stuff, making sure you have a place where your loved ones can find everything in order. Where's did he have life insurance, and what was still active and in place? What was the net worth? So I'm not going on a treasure hunt to try to find things. I know, okay, he had these 3 accounts and he had this and that. And just all those things that will instill in the next generation, boy, he really cared about us because he put this stuff in order. So I'm not, having to do all this work and go hither and yon. Most of us have stories about a loved one who passed away and everything was a mess. Were they really caring about us? So part of it is you have to recognize that, yes, that you're mortal, and that mortality could end at any particular day. And so don't put it off because, the Lord has granted me 84 years or 97 years. No, he hasn't. You don't know that. Right. And so making sure at any given time things are in order. So having the right documents in place, but also having everything organized enough so people can pretty quickly find it.
Mm-hmm. And we've mentioned this verse a bunch. He who doesn't provide for his own household is worse than an unbeliever. I think this is in a lot of ways your way of doing that in providing it. You may have provided financially your entire life, and then you pass away, and if your family has no idea how to actually start to unwind these things and start to go through this process, that's not a great provision to them in the after you passed away. So this is a way for you to provide for your family as well, in addition to the way that you provided your entire life.
Yeah, and it is an expression of love to have everything in order, so that it's smooth, it's simple, it's easy, it's direct. People understand it. And one of the things I think you also want to do is have some kind of delightful surprises in there. Oh, they were thinking about this. Oh, he left this particular thing to grandson number 3, or so they'll think, oh, this was very thoughtful. We've all gone through situations where someone did something thoughtful to us and think, wow, they were really thinking about me. You kind of want to leave that impression with your estate plan and how you've put everything together, that at that moment when they're grieving your loss, oh, he was thinking about me. And that's why sometimes we even say, if you have a limited estate, leave $100 or leave something to your grandchildren, because someone's going to hand them something saying, "Granddad left this for you," and they'll be thinking, "Oh, he was thinking about me, he loved me," all that stuff. So it is an act of love. So you need to think about it in that way, even though it's difficult to do. And one of the reasons people don't get their estate plans done is you have to think about your mortality. You have to think about when all of this happens, when all this expression of love actually manifests itself, I will be dead. And a lot of people don't want to think about that, but it's reality, so we need to.
One of the things we've talked about at Stonecrop, trying to encourage clients to consider, is writing some kind of letter to their loved ones and leaving behind not just an act of love in, here's how you access my accounts and get this stuff going. How about an actual letter that tells you everything about what you mean to me as a person and the importance of that kind of a legacy?
Yeah, there's so many ways of doing that. I have a good friend who's about my age. His father-in-law passed away about 5 years ago. And about 10 years prior to that, he went to his father-in-law, who he really looked up to, and helped him to get into the business he got into, was a bit of a mentor to him. And but was kind of the father-in-law was a bit of a hard driver and didn't really like to get, sentimental. But my friend went to him and said, as a gift this year for my birthday, I would really love it if you would just write me a letter, as to what I should do, and he laughed at him at first because he, again, not a sentimental guy, but then he actually took it really seriously and wrote out this very, very kind and very insightful letter to my friend, who still has it in his wallet. It's all, he opens it up every once in a while. It's incredibly meaningful. And so, to be able to sit down and write a letter to your son, your daughter, your grandchild, a friend, maybe a friend who you feel like, is not a believer, but you've been trying to argue him into the kingdom your whole life. It's your last shot at it. Maybe it's the most effective one, or just some other, some other person who's really important in your life. not many of us experience this, but just imagine receiving that letter after your good friend or after your grandfather or parent has died, and seeing this letter that was obviously very thoughtfully written right to you. And again, it's a way of, writing out. Sometimes when you write them out in a way that you've never said before, or you say them in a more detailed way, or you can say it in a way that you feel comfortable when you're writing it down, and they hear it in a way they've never heard it before, and it can be incredibly meaningful in their lives. So, yeah, we encourage that. We actually at Stonecrop have a program of videos that can help you actually draft that. That can be an incredibly powerful, lifelong way to help people of the next generation or two.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, something that this might be silly, but I have 2 really little kids, and I set up email addresses for them just so that they have that ready by the time they come of age, and they already have an email address. And so every once in a while when I think about it, I send them an email, and I just write something that they did that day or something that was touching to me, or just expressing how much I love them while they're 3 years old.
Right.
And I don't know when they're going to get that email account, but they'll see that. And I hope that, it means a lot to them. It's, nothing beats a handwritten note that is very thoughtful, but I just thought every once in a while I'm going to send my kids an email and they'll read it someday.
Which is great, because sometimes people are intimidated by sitting down and writing a letter. Boy, that's going to take a while. I don't know what to say. But if you have a thought, just write it. So a short little email, that's great. At one point, I just sat in my office at home and looked around at all the kind of sentimental pieces of property. If you're ever in a meeting with me, you can see behind me some of those things in the bookcase. And I said, okay, I'm going to write out who gets what and why. And it became a really interesting exercise and kind of a heartwarming one. And it made me, when I mentioned the example of leaving a Bible to a certain person, I realized that throughout my life, I still had my King James Bible that I got when I was 8 years old, and a Bible that I had in college, and and they're all beat up and everything, but they have notes in them and things like that. So I'm going to leave those to certain people and explain why and how this is meaningful. It didn't take long, but it's there now. It's going to potentially be there forever, hopefully for many decades before anyone ever reads it. So it doesn't have to be a long 3-hour exercise of coming up with a 5-page letter. That would be great. But if you don't have the time to do that, but if something comes to mind and you can do something meaningful like writing an email that they'll get, then that's great.
Yeah, I think it's cool to see the creativity involved in estate planning. That a lot of people just think, I just need a will and that's all I need. But that there's so much more to it, and that you can hopefully have fun doing it, in the sense that, it's not fun to think about your ultimate demise, but what you can pass on to the next generation, and enjoy the process of, I love that. I'm giving you this baseball bat because I saw you hit a home run as a little kid, and I wanted you to have that. Like, things like that are just so cool.
Yeah, and from the opposite perspective, we're talking about the positive reason for doing it. The negative reinforcement for doing it is, when I was preparing an estate planning seminar on all this at one point, I queried a lot of different people who are involved at people at the time of their death. So doctors, nurses, funeral directors, pastors, you name it. And a common theme, especially amongst the pastors actually, was that personal property, those sentimental pieces of personal property, direct where they're going to go, because that's what creates the arguments. So, there's a family that has where they have an old piano, and they have 2 children who both play the piano. Who's going to get that piano if they don't write it out? Because personal property, people don't often direct where that goes.
Solomon says, cut the piano in half.
That would be one way of doing it. But the past, I have stories, some from my own experience doing estate planning, some from querying these other people, decade-long rifts in families due to arguments over sentimental pieces of personal property. It's usually not an argument over the $500,000 mutual fund account. It's usually sentimental pieces of property. So if you see anything that could cause a rift, you know, in our house, we have a coffee table that my deceased brother built. No one's really claiming that or saying, you know, but it's, you know, it could cause an argument. Wait a minute, I thought I was going to get that. If there's some unclaimed or unspoken, potentially unspoken attitude that way, it can cause real rifts in families. So let them be mad at you because by definition you are dead.
Yeah.
So don't try to avoid that if you see any possibility of any of your pieces of personal property creating arguments.
One of the things I was curious about, because I'm a greedy firstborn, is how the law evolved. So back in biblical times, the default was firstborn gets
Right.
most or all.
Right.
And so I did a little bit of background research, and it looked like Rome kind of started switching that by forcing people to kind of have heirs, and it made it harder to disinherit people. But then England kind of brought it back because they didn't want their large estates to get broken up, and the best way to do that was to leave it to one. And then it looked like kind of the American Revolution, they pushed that. I think it was called like progeniture or something.
Yeah.
Where they decided to go against that. Do you have any background there and why that was decided?
Don't know that as well. I know obviously the United States took a lot of the English common law, but also had some of their own ideas because we were way more egalitarian. And so there's a lot of fighting against some of that kind of royal type of thinking in their law. So it's very possible a result of that the default in this country became equal. Because if you look at the intestate laws, which are the laws that say if you don't have a will, this is where your property goes, they don't say that the oldest gets the most. And I don't think there's a state in the Union that ever said that. They all say equal. And in the common law, meaning the Old English common law, wasn't always that way. And so I'm pretty sure the U.S. has always been that way from day one when they were passing those intestate laws.
Do you think the majority of people, even when they're setting up their estate plan, essentially stick with the default?
Yep. And that's not to say in your particular case it's wrong. All I'm saying with this is prayerfully think about it. Should you be giving all your property equally, not only equally in amount, but also equally in manner? So I'll give one stark example. I had a woman come into my office when I was drafting wills, and she had 3 children. I said, okay, child number 1, tell me about him, blah, blah, blah. Okay, yeah. I want, and she was older, so all her children were older. So when I die, I want him to get 1/3, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Child number 2, went through the same conversation. Child number 3, I don't want that deadbeat to ever have his hands on, I want him to get money, but he should never have control of it. So we had to set up something where he was going to get income every year as long as there was money. And so it was a trust that was very highly controlled. So that was a case where she decided, yes, I'm going to go with the default of giving them each 1/3. I'm not going to disinherit him, but I have to control it to bless him, essentially, even though she said some colorful language about him. So I've seen more the manner be different than the amount, but sometimes the amount. And that usually is in blended family situations where, or some case where there's just a family member, a child or whatever, who's just not lived a good life and has broken away from the family or done some things. So it has to be pretty stark generally, in my experience, for parents to either give a child less or give another child more or give them nothing. So the vast majority come in and don't even think about it. And the reason for it is largely because even though I think child number 2 should get the most, I don't want them to be mad at me. And again, in my thinking, let them be mad at you. Do what you think is right because you're not going to be around for them to be mad at. And so...
Do they always know? Is there a way for the children to not know?
Well, a trust is a good way of them not knowing, because a will, if you leave everything in your will to the next generation, if everything goes through probate in the will, that is public and people can look that up and say, read the will. They can read exactly what was in your estate and what went where. So sometimes you'll see it in the news because that's what happened. A lot of times these rich people you don't see because they put everything in a trust and trust is private. So you can potentially hide it from your children. You have to be pretty forward thinking to do that. And so it is possible for them to not know.
Logan, something else that I was just thinking about, you had discovered fairly recently, I think you were talking to an attorney about if you have young kids and you and your spouse both pass away, let's say you're on a date and you get hit by a car together and your kids are still alive, what happens to your kids? And what's something you could do to prep to make sure that your kids don't end up, the state decides that, right? If you don't have something in place.
I think the attorney told me the state first decides until they figure out what the will says. Is that correct?
Well, things happen fast. Obviously, if there's the children have to be housed by somebody. Now, normally, someone will step forward, grandma, sister, brother, or something like that. And if the authorities think that there's no problem there, like it's not an abusive household or drugs or something like that, they'll let it go. But the judge ultimately has to decide, is this in the best interest of the children? So normally where it's a problem is when you get sister one and sister two saying, no, I want them. And there's a fight, and that's a problem. But yeah, they can go into foster care if it's unclear. So that's, but they will respect the will unless there's a reason not to. And that's a really good example of, to apply to everything, because if you're thinking about, okay, who are going to be the guardians of my children if something happens to me while they're minors, you're going to give that a lot of thought. Who's that guardian going to be? I want that guardian to have similar values, similar faith, to raise them, the way I want them to be raised, to not be abusive, all those things. You're going to give a lot of thought and size that person up. And you're probably going to talk to that person and make sure they know how you're raising your children. Well, think the same way with your trustee and all of that. It's almost like one of the complaints often that happens in the estate planning world is we'll say people spend more time prepping a babysitter than they will putting their estate plan together. So try to use that analogy to realize you need to put some thought into what happens in the next generation.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Doug. If you could leave listeners just with one kind of closing challenge or thought with regard to their own estate plans, what's one thing they could do today to make sure?
I guess the most important thing I would say, because everyone already has in mind, yeah, I need a will, yeah, I need to do those things. Everyone knows that. Is to think hard and long about what they want the next generation to believe, what values they want to pass on, and come up with a plan to do it. If you want this particular child to move closer to having a faith like yours or whatever, well, I guess I should arrange to have lunch with them once a quarter. I guess I should have a plan. Be thinking it through, and just like a lot of other things in your life, put together some sort of a semblance, even if it's just in your mind, a plan to do it, and don't just let it be accidental.
Yeah. Well, thank you for listening to another episode of Plan to Prosper, and we hope you enjoyed the episode. God bless.
God bless.
God bless.
Investment advisory services offered through Stonecrop Wealth Advisors, LLC, a registered investment advisor with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. This material is intended for informational purposes only.